Hello everyone, and UnleashedBread if you find this video. I wanted to respond to your Elden Ring vs Dark Souls 3 video, as when I first listened to it I honestly felt it was riddled with writing problems, but still presented some solid takes. I then noticed a number of comments describing exactly what I was thinking. So I figured I'd respond too, but go into more detail than just a comment would allow. I won't be responding to every single statement, but I will be responding to the main points and try to cut out the fluff where I can, as to not make this video excessively long. If anyone watching feels I've wrongly ignored sections or cut things out that shouldn't have been, please do call me out on it, as it will help me make better content in the future. I also want to make clear that this isn't intended to be mean or disrespectful in any way. I'm sure I'll come off that way at some point in the response, but I mean it all as constructively as I can. I enjoyed the video, even though it is very flawed. At the time of me finishing my script and recording this, your last post was a Sekiro speedrun stream, which I very much enjoyed by the way, 9 months ago. So I hope this will help encourage you to continue making analysis content and videos in general in the future. Lastly, before getting into the response, I genuinely think there are a lot of good starting points in this video, and I would love to see some of them expanded on, but it stops before anything can actually develop into a full analysis, and that's really where the problems are, as we'll see once we start going through it. Now, with all that out of the way, thank you for stopping by, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll stick around until the end.
Alright, so 3 things before the video I need to quickly note so this makes sense. 1. This video is broken up into 6 parts where I talk about 6 different reasons why I think Dark Souls 3 is better than Elden Ring. I will be referring to and showing all parts of these games, so here's your spoiler warning. Alright, number 2. You're probably going to disagree with some of my takes here, which is great, and I'm excited to hear the discussion around this. But I would ask you, if your take is longer than like 1-2 paragraphs max, don't put it in the freaking comments. Just make your own audio recording and make a dumb YouTube video like I did, okay? I'm not trying to lose my eyesight reading your takes on the symbolism of the ball sacks of Radahn's horse, okay? Just make a YouTube video out of it. Thank you. Okay, number 3, the last point. Throughout this video I have footage from Dark Souls 3, Elden Ring, and even a little bit of Sekiro, and the footage doesn't necessarily emphasize the points I'm making at that time. I just wanted to throw something that you could watch and be entertained by in the background. It's not necessarily an exact representation of the points I'm making.
To start off, we are presented with a few details regarding the structure of the video. 1 being that it will be broken into 6 parts, which I'll say here, since they were not in the original video introduction. These are bosses, tone, combat, the open world, PvP, and replayability. 2. You, as in the viewer, will probably disagree, which I must say, props to you, UnleashedBread. The willingness to admit that your opinion may be unpopular, and that you are ready to discuss points and opinions with those who disagree right at the get-go, is more than many others are willing to say, especially when seemingly disagreeing with the masses. Although, you say this and then take a half step back by including a stipulation. If the comment is longer than 2 paragraphs, don't bother, make a video. You play it off like a joke, which I'll admit I did find funny, and if it was meant as a joke and I'm just taking it literally, then disregard. But not everyone who wants to further the discourse is willing, ready, or able to make videos. So the seeming lack of willingness to respond to comments, just because they're too long for you, is unfortunate. I, however, am one of those people who can and will make a video response, and I have also read a good portion of the comments for your original video. So I find it unfortunate that you say this, but only under certain conditions. Again, that is if taking it literally and it was meant as a joke. 3. You say there is footage from Dark Souls 3, Elden Ring, and Sekiro, but that not all of it is representative of the commentary, meaning this can be a strictly auditory experience if preferred, and since that's the case, I will do the same. Now those of you watching my video can also have an auditory focused experience, and may disregard the footage from here on out if you so choose. Later in the video I will have some footage that matches the commentary, but it won't be required to understand what is being discussed. Additionally, I will say I appreciate the acknowledgement that the video is not entirely representative of what is being described. This is actually something I failed to do in my previous video, in that only some of the footage lined up with what I was saying, and the rest was just filler gameplay.
I want to start off with one of my strongest points. Dark Souls 3 straight up has better boss fights than Elden Ring. Bosses are my absolute favorite parts of any games, and From Software has learned how to perfect boss fights, and they did in Dark Souls 3, which in my opinion has multiple of the best boss fights of all time in it. Elden Ring just pales in comparison.
Well, we'll see how strong the point is, but I will say this is an unfortunate start. You've set the basis for this video in that it is essentially all personal opinion, but you attempt to state it as fact. To be clear, there's nothing wrong with having the opinions you do, and there's certainly nothing wrong with sharing those opinions. What is a problem, however, is when you have an opinion and then state it as if it's something objective, especially when you can't support it with anything concrete. Additionally, you claim From Software has perfected boss fights. I'm sure there are plenty of fans who would agree with this perspective without even thinking about it first, but I have to ask, how does one perfect boss fights? Is that something that is even possible, objectively? If the art of the boss fight, and by that I mean if crafting a perfect boss fight was possible, wouldn't they just have to copy and paste until they had a full game length of bosses, and put whatever else in between and then just keep doing that? You're taking the isolated experience of the boss fight itself and looking at it in a vacuum, when there's so much more that goes into each experience. You're completely ignoring context. Let's say, hypothetically, that Dark Souls 3 is a collection of perfect boss fights, but we can only say that with them being in the context they are in, because once removed, all changes. I mean, even if you took a Dark Souls 3 boss and put it into Dark Souls 1, I don't believe any would work, because so much in the very structure of the games, mechanically, is different. Funnily enough, Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring are the closest to each other when it comes to gameplay mechanics. So if one had perfect boss fights, applying the gameplay mechanics of the other would be the closest experience compared to any of the other games.
Now, you could go ahead and say, well, this is just your subjective opinion, yeah, and it's a weak argument because it's all based on opinion. I say no, because I did math on it, and I hate math, and that proves that this is more legitimate than just a fairy tale opinion. I went through and scored each main boss in Elden Ring in 4 categories that all combined together. If a perfect boss existed, it would score 40 points, okay? 10 points come from boss moves and design, 10 points for the boss arena, 10 points for the boss music, and 10 points for overall fun to master gameplay. Maybe I'll make a video later showing how each boss fight ranks in the Souls games if you guys care. Well, this is just your subjective opinion, yeah,
is exactly what I'm saying, because that's exactly what it is. You went through, and you scored each main boss. That means there's no data, there's no metrics, there's no science to it or further analysis. As far as we know, you made up the categories, you picked the numbers, and you scored them according to your own scale, which isn't even detailed in this video. The only math involved was adding up the numbers from each category to get the total. To put it as plainly as possible, this is the pseudo-logic you're attempting to apply. I watched a movie. I scored it 10 out of 10. Also, I hate numbers. Therefore, since I used numbers to score it, and I do not like numbers, it must be a 10 out of 10 movie. Going forward from that, how do you even objectively score or measure boss moves and design? How do you objectively measure boss arena or boss music? I won't even ask that about the 4th category because you cannot objectively measure how much fun anything is. The results of that question, no matter who they come from or how they reach their conclusion, is subjective. Fun is not a category that you can measure with any amount of objectivity, so it holds no weight in the discussion of which game is better or better designed.
Elden Ring's bosses were consistently hitting a score of like 25 out of 40, which is respectable for sure. That's good. The highest scoring boss, and therefore the best ranking boss in Elden Ring, is Godric the Crafted, with a score of 35 out of 40. That's a great boss fight. That's S tier. But he is kind of like the exception to the rule, generally speaking. Most bosses didn't break 30 points. On the other hand, Dark Souls 3 bosses are literally almost all S tier ranking, between 35 and 40 points. Don't believe me? How about we refresh some memories here? Champion Gundyr, Abyss Watchers, Pontiff Sullivan, the Dancer, the Twin Princes, Nameless King, Friday, and to top it off with a literal perfect 40 out of 40. In my opinion, the best boss fight all of Souls, Slave Knight Gale, S tier.
I'm not going to respond to any of this in detail because, as I described, these numbers are entirely arbitrary. Although you've listed what I imagine most Souls players would consider the best boss fights from 3, these are the popular picks. Not that it would really matter, but you didn't even provide your own scores for the rest of these bosses. It's really just a baseless declaration that the best boss fights in Dark Souls 3 are better than the best boss fights in Elden Ring. I will also say that Abyss Watchers, Twin Princes, Nameless King, and Gale are among my favorites from Dark Souls 3. But I will also say that's just my opinion, and I won't say they're better than any bosses of Elden Ring, at least not without evidence to support it.
These are all just in Dark Souls 3, bro. And those are just the S's. There are A tiers, and to be fair, there are lower ranking bosses, like, I don't know, Deacons of the Deep, or that weird tree boss. Those are not S tiers, those are not A tier, they're lower. But let's just compare this to Elden Ring. And I know Elden Ring doesn't have its DLCs yet, which I hope will add some more S tiers. But if you just do the straight up math, Elden Ring is already far behind on the frequency of amazing boss fights in comparison to Dark Souls 3. And if you disagree with me, okay, that means that you think Renala is S tier. Bruh. It means you think Radon is almost a perfect boss. Okay? It means you think that the Elden Beast is on par with the Lord of Cinder.
First off,
these are all just in Dark Souls 3, bro.
I mean, I would hope so. This is a comparison of Elden Ring and Dark Souls 3 specifically, so I don't know why any other game would be referenced here. Wording nitpick aside, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt and trust your phrasing here is intentional. Otherwise,
like, I don't know, Deacons of the Deep, or that weird tree boss,
is just showing everyone watching your video that you didn't really take the time to review your script. Also, that weird tree boss being the Curse-Rotted Greatwood, which you show on screen when saying that, but still phrase it that way, implies you didn't know the name of the boss while preparing your script, and that you couldn't be bothered to look it up, or to re-record that line while you were editing the video. I'll admit that during my first listen to the video, I wasn't watching it. I just had it playing in the background, and I didn't remember the name of the boss either. But it took me about 10 seconds to look it up and make sure I had it right for my script.
The Elden Beast is a straight 1 out of 10 in the funness score. You spend like 70% just running these great football field distances just so you can get up to him and swing your sword. Even spells, you can't do them from that far away because he just teleports, okay? I just think it's straight up bad. And I feel like they forgot to allow you to like summon your horse in that fight. I think it's like an error, it's that bad. And I'm just trying to be brutally honest with you, okay? Most bosses in Elden Ring are good, and they are fun, but they are no Slave Knight Gale, okay? Maybe I'll make a ranking video later where I go through these individually and talk about the specifics of the 4 sections of my 40-point scoring system. But the math as it stands puts Dark Souls 3 bosses' grades ahead in most cases. And the jarring downgrading quality that I consistently notice in Elden Ring's bosses that I want to bring up right now is the boss music.
I will personally agree that the Elden Beast was a lackluster final boss fight, but there is no objective funness score. Whatever experience you had with it is your own, and I'm sure there are many players for whom the Elden Beast is a favorite, but liking the fight doesn't mean it's a good fight. The same way you disliking it doesn't make it a bad fight. You say you might make a ranking video and go through all the bosses with the specifics of the 4 categories, but that should have been done in this video. You've referenced and compared so many bosses without providing any substance as to the ratings.
I've gone through and listened to all the OSTs as I was ranking them, and so many of the major cutscene bosses, the big bosses, just fall flat. Their music has nothing memorable. It makes me think that there was a conscious decision to not make the interest too interesting for some reason. Go and listen to Melania's boss music, and then go listen to the Twin Prince's boss music, if you don't believe me. It's an inarguable downgrade in musical quality. This and other factors of the scoring system all prove that Elden Ring's bosses are good, but not on par with the great bosses of Dark Souls 3.
I'm going to go on a little tangent here and say I've heard a lot of people criticize the music in Elden Ring for being more subdued and reserved compared to the bombastic and more traditionally epic tracks throughout that of the Souls series. If the developers wanted equally hard-hitting tracks from the composers, you don't think they'd send the tracks back and say, no, make it more like this, while referencing the Souls soundtracks? Surely they must have had that power during development. What I'm saying is that the music is what the composers and developers wanted and intended. Unless I missed something, which, if I have, do please let me know. But unless I missed something, no developer or composer has come forward and said anything along the lines of, we didn't make what we really wanted, or we couldn't follow through our plan, or our vision. Anything suggesting Elden Ring and the soundtrack were not what they wanted to make. As far as we know, we got the exact product the developers and composers intended. To close this part, I will simply say all of the music is at minimum serviceable. Nothing is thematically or tonally inconsistent. Nothing is out of place. Nothing was recorded or mixed inadequately. Nothing is of low audio fidelity. There's not really anything else you can argue against or for either of the soundtracks beyond that isn't subjective.
Okay, next up is tonality. Now, the tonality of the Souls games is traditionally very dark and gritty. Dark Souls 3 is a straight up horror game at some points. That's why on Steam it could be grouped up with other easier to spot genre placeholders like, I don't know, Resident Evil or VR Chat. Just kidding. But Elden Ring doesn't have that same scare element that my favorite moments of the franchise has had. Here, there's not the dark, oppressive atmosphere that works in tonality with the gruelingly difficult combat. In Dark Souls 3, when I'm exploring the backside of the Lothar Castle, and I stumble upon an area called the Consumed King's Garden, I feel it in my gut that I'm not welcomed here, and I'm supposed to uncover something abysmally horrifying in this misty mire.
There is one phrase I'm going to focus on here as I believe it discounts the rest of the arguments in the section entirely, which can be applied to a good portion of arguments made against Elden Ring as a whole. And this is something I've heard many content creators do.
But Elden Ring doesn't have that same scare element that my favorite moments of the franchise has had.
The franchise? Elden Ring is not part of any franchise other than its own. Unless you're implying From Software games as a whole are one franchise. I know there are theories that all of the Souls games, Bloodborne and Elden Ring, are part of a connected multiverse of sorts. But unfortunately for all those theorists, as it stands, Elden Ring is a new IP completely separate from Dark Souls. I don't understand why so many feel the need to compare it to Dark Souls so directly, as if it were Dark Souls 4 instead of its own standalone franchise. It makes me concerned that people are going to judge all new FromSoft works as if they are part of the same series, like if they deviate too much from what we know as their core gameplay template, it won't be good enough. The point is, From Software has many IPs to work with, and luckily has the creative freedom to develop new IPs alongside their existing ones. Not every new game from them needs to be Dark Souls 4 or Bloodborne 2, although I know plenty of people are begging for exactly that. Are they similar? Yes, absolutely. There's clearly a lot of design elements and philosophies that have been carried over. I mean, there are literally in-game assets carried over from the Souls series to Elden Ring, but that doesn't mean the developers are trying to make the same thing, or even more specific, something with the same tone. People don't compare the tones of Jak and Daxter to The Last of Us, even though both were developed by Naughty Dog. People don't look at Skyrim and complain that it wasn't vibrant and highly saturated like Oblivion was. And those two actually are in the same series. Comparing Elden Ring to Dark Souls as if it was supposed to be just like it is simply misguided and unfair.
It's a new IP, it's Elden Ring, so it doesn't have to be scary. But you tell me this, what is the tone of Elden Ring? I don't know, Elden Ring maybe represents things aging, an aging land or something. But they really honestly don't have a solid theme that works with the gameplay. And what I'm saying is the tone of the Dark Souls, dark, fits in perfectly with its dark and oppressive combat. The enemy is scary. Guess what? It's also scary when the enemy hits you and kills you in one hit. These things fit together like two perfect puzzle pieces. Elden Ring does not have the same puzzle piece perfection.
What is the tone of the movie Alien? Alien... Wait. Title doesn't have to have anything to do with tone. When hearing the word alien, any person can think any number of things, ranging from the suspenseful atmospheric horror of the 1979 film Alien, all the way to the over-the-top comedy of a movie like Mars Attacks, or the game Destroy All Humans. A title is not required to convey the exact tone of that piece of media. It is simply a title, and whether or not it conveys tone is entirely up to the creators. Now, I'm going to use a bit more flowery language for a moment, but Dark Souls as a series can easily be interpreted as fatalistic, with many characters displaying a sort of misplaced faith, as many are clinging to the hope brought by a dying flame. Yet we know as the player that no matter the option chosen in the previous games, the world itself seems to be stuck in the repeating cycle of decay, bound to a flame clinging to life, same as the inhabitants of the world do. In Elden Ring, you are a tarnished of no renown, seeking to become the Elden Lord, on a quest to defeat what is recognized as a god in the in-game world. Margit, the first intended story boss, describes the player as emboldened by the flame of ambition. You start as a nobody, and are achieving the impossible almost every step through the game, and it is recognized. There's much more hope in Elden Ring. In addition, in terms of world design, the bright colors and vibrant landscapes, and in terms of gameplay mechanics, the greater focus on magic, the tone is more high fantasy, while the Soul series is much closer to dark fantasy. Again, the two IPs are intended to accomplish two different things, and despite the plethora of similarities, they are doing so.
Okay, now we're going to talk about the combat. This might be the longest section, but I have a lot I want to say about it. Elden Ring's combat overall is super awesome. I'm not going to debate that. When you compare it to the vast majority of single-player games out there, it honestly just stands out as one of the clear leaders in the industry, okay? I think it has great combat. I think that's one of the reasons why so many other titles and other games are slowly transforming into Souls-like combat-style games. Heck, even Assassin's Creed is getting in on this. Yeah, Elden Ring has really great combat and is mostly fine for most people as they make their way through it. But with all that being said, Dark Souls 3 is better. And I really do want to note here that I think Sekiro personally takes the cake for most enjoyable combat to master, that blade-to-blade cutthroat katana clashing. But this video isn't about Sekiro, unfortunately. It's about Elden Ring, and here I'm discussing why Dark Souls 3's combat system is superior to Elden Ring's. And I think we'll see more discussion on this within the community as time goes on, but I'm here to discuss the two strongest points I have against ER's combat that I have noticed so easily have robbed so many people of that typical satisfaction and enjoyment that I usually do feel in Dark Souls. First, the biggest culprit is the chronic over-reliance upon ranged spells. Now, I don't think it's the player's fault if they use ranged spells to defeat bosses. Heck, the game gives you these magical tools, why not use them? It's safer, you're gonna survive more. It's easier, okay? 100% correct. Elden Ring just hands out range spells a little too easily and a little too much, in my opinion. And I'll give you an example as to why I think this. Because this is an open world game, you're going to be drawn to loot and to look around the area and find the best items. Hypothetically, a player could just ride around past the bosses, past the difficult people, Malekith, Godric, and snatch one of the many powerful ranged spells in this game. Maybe you watched a YouTube video that actually showed you exactly where to get it from. And there you go, you're set to defeat almost all of the hardest bosses in the game just because you have a zappy spell. Oh, Elden Ring needs an easy mode. It has one! Ranged spells. And I'm not just trying to cause hate on all magic. I just hate range magic. I wish From Software made more spells that were less about range and more just about melee. That would be awesome.
How many spells are in Elden Ring? What percentage of them are ranged? How accessible are they from the start? What are the level and resource requirements for those spells? These are the details you should be going into if you really want to convince the viewer, but instead, you just say you don't like range magic, think there's too much, and want more melee. What about the players who prefer the magic power fantasy? Would a greater focus on melee over magic benefit them? I'm going to give one example of this, but a brief internet search tells me that Loretta's Great Bow is among the stronger ranged spells in the game, so I'm going to use that for this example. Now, you're arguing that a new player can just pick the Astrologer, the most magic-aligned starting class, look up where the best spells are, easily pick them up, ride around past the bosses is how you described it, and then blitz through the game, or at least a significant enough portion of the game for it to be a problem. First, if a new player looks up the strongest ranged spells, which is exactly what I did, they'll find Loretta's Great Bow, hence the use of it in this example. Loretta's Great Bow is obtained at the end of Caria Manor by defeating Royal Knight Loretta. Again, assuming this is a brand new player just on a hunt to get the best spells as early as possible, getting through Caria Manor and then defeating Loretta is not an easy to-do list to accomplish. You can't just walk around and find this spell like you've implied. Surely many new players would get stuck at Loretta, if not while trying to get through Caria Manor itself. I imagine some new players would even get stuck on the way to Caria Manor. Then, whatever players succeeded, they now have Loretta's Great Bow. Again, assuming the player starts with the Astrologer class, they begin with 16 intelligence points. Loretta's Great Bow has a minimum intelligence requirement of 26. I'm assuming the player has only leveled a handful of times, since they are trying to get the best spells before anything else. I am assuming that includes before leveling. This means they'd have to continue leveling in order to use it. Even if they did meet the level requirements upon defeating Loretta, it's certainly not just walking around and picking up the best spells no problem like you described. A powerful ranged spell seems like a perfectly appropriate reward for surviving Caria Manor and defeating Loretta at its end.
Now, I played all these games both ways, melee and magic, and when using ranged magic, I believe that you will rob yourself out of the most satisfying and godlike combat I think you can encounter in gaming. Dark Souls 3 is a great example of a melee-heavy game in the series, which I believe sets the player up to feel these godlike thrills more often. There are spells and pyromancies in Dark Souls 3, but I think the balance of their implementation is way better done in that game than Elden Ring. Now maybe you do enjoy the easy path to victory and not getting within 100 yards of the enemy, and you think that that's fun. That's you. I'm not going to downgrade you. That's fun, okay. But I am telling you, in my experience, I've done it both ways. You get so much more of an emotional high and satisfaction when you're able to get right up into the boss's faces, and you're able to confidently counter each of their moves with a well-timed dodge and a swift swing of your sword, and that anticipatory step back and then javelin thrust into their gut. The difference is, Elden Ring is like listening to music. I think Dark Souls 3 is like listening to music and dancing to it. The difference is getting an A on your Spanish test, or actually being able to speak a fluent language, you know? And it's hard, I'm not going to deny that. It's hard to master something like this, where there's so much to learn and all these subtleties you gotta figure out. But it's just like climbing a mountain. You if you just drive to the top, the satisfaction is robbed of you of climbing it. The view is so much more rewarding when you climb step for step. And I know I'm sounding like one of those get good elitist D-bags you'll find online, but I'm just trying to be honest with you. I think that it's more fun when you do melee.
This part is honestly confusing, going from saying it's acceptable that you, the range player, enjoy playing range builds, but that you're also wrong and will enjoy it more if you play with a melee build. I fully believe that most players familiar with From Software would agree that melee builds are more rewarding and more satisfying due to the greater challenge and higher risk versus reward moment-to-moment gameplay. That, however, does not mean it is objectively better. Just because you felt more enjoyment with a melee build doesn't mean it is the objectively better build. Nor does it mean everyone would enjoy a melee build more. Don't tell players they will definitively enjoy one playstyle over another when it's just your preference. On top of that, many of the bosses in both Elden Ring and Dark Souls 3 can be described as hyper-aggressive, some even having input reads. What I mean by this is if you create a distance between yourself and the boss, then trigger an action like casting a spell, the AI of the boss will read the input immediately and react to cancel it. Even creating distance and then attempting to heal can be difficult with the input reads of some bosses. Margit, I think, is a great example of this. Reading the movements and finding the windows of opportunity, even just to heal, can be a significant challenge for many new players. Malenia is another boss who is notorious for input reading. Being at range doesn't mean you get a free pass through any boss fight. There is still plenty of challenge and opportunity for failure before you start learning the movesets and timing, regardless of the distance between you and the boss. Then you move to comparisons of experience, with the last one actually being perfectly appropriate. It's just like climbing a mountain. If you just drive to the top, the satisfaction is robbed if you love climbing. Well, if you love climbing, then you would choose to climb the mountain. If you don't like climbing, and you do like driving, you will choose to drive. And you will be happy after the drive that you didn't have to climb. So if you enjoy range builds, you will choose a range build, and you will be happy that you didn't have to engage in any melee combat. You can argue what is more or less efficient and effective in terms of beating the game, but not in terms of enjoying it.
The second part of my general combat complaint in Elden Ring is sort of a minute subtlety, but I think the longtime players will recognize it. Elden Ring has some enemies and some bosses which actually break the combat rules of the world that have been set up. And this goes super deep behind the scenes into combat mechanics and enemy AI, and I don't feel like I can explain it nearly as well as this great YouTube video by Swagapagos Turtle called Malenia Doesn't Play by the Rules.
He goes on to summarize the video, which, as said, is a good video, informative and well-structured. Now, to quickly summarize his summary, he lists moves of some different bosses and describes some as spam, and most of them as too fast and impossible to dodge. To put it plainly, this is just inaccurate, at least in the case of impossible to dodge. I'm sure plenty would agree that there is some attack spamming. I know it's been quite a while since this video came out, but even at the time of release, there were no-hit runs for the bosses listed, those being Margit, Malekith, Malenia, Godric, and Radagon. Now, there are even level 1 no-hit, no-rolling playthroughs, against Malenia specifically. Bosses not playing by the rules is such a strange argument to me. When was the boss ever supposed to follow the same rules as the player? Bosses are not equivalent to the player. To specify, the examples of the listed are animation cancels, lifesteal, and her waterfowl dance attack being activated even when staggered. Malenia is a demigod in lore, the goddess of rot. The player is a nobody. She should be, and is, well above the player in basically every way. Whether you view these differences in ability as fair or not is up to the person, but if players are able to not only beat these bosses, but do so without taking damage, and while at the lowest level possible, well, none of these bosses are impossible. The point is that you enter the arena not knowing what to expect, and that you need to learn what you are up against, learn the rules of the boss, and overcome the challenge they provide, according to whatever rules they play by.
I have beef with these types of attacks because I'm arguing that it actually makes these games less fun to engage with. I love trying to master these fights, these bosses, so I could have a perfect no-hit run, which is impossible to engage with certain enemies during certain attacks, like I've mentioned, because instead of this back and forth dance I talked about, you're forced to just keep your distance from them and avoid the combat altogether. It's almost like anti-combat, and it feels artificial when it's unavoidable, and that's unfair to me and bad. And by the way, don't try to argue with me that everything is unfair in these games, because they're not. There's probably a dozen other good video essays on YouTube explaining why the difficult in Dark Souls is challenging, but not exactly unfair.
Ignoring that the argument is about something being less fun, I'm going to simply expand on what I said previously. The number of updates to the game that the listed moves of Malenia have gone untouched tells us that those are intentional design choices, not errors. If they were unintended, From Software would have patched them away by now, and the first patch that changed anything to do with Malenia was the correction of a multiplayer-only bug that made her heal more often than she should have. That was with her lifesteal ability. The following patch, which was released 4 months after launch, fixed a bug where she would start Phase 2 with less health than she should have. That patch, patch 105, makes her even harder to beat, and has been the last update to Malenia so far, and I'm writing this a year and a half after the game was released. Regardless of how fair things are, the challenges posed, even when self-imposed, like no hit, no damage, level 1 challenges, are all achievable. I don't know what's better proof of mastery than challenges like those, and proving they are attainable, instead of just saying they're unfair and calling it bad.
Alright, this one's going to take a little bit of explaining, and I'll do my best to articulate why I feel this way. I think the feel of a linear game beats the feel of an open world game in the From Software storytelling department.
Before going into any detail, let me first say this. Nothing in the explanation unwrites the admittance that this is all subjective. I think the feel of a linear game beats the feel of an open world game. Now, he does specify that this is in reference to From Software storytelling, which I'm guessing means storytelling that is indirect and told through item descriptions and environment more than anything else. Doubling down on the subjectivity, you're not even saying linear design itself is better. You're saying you think it feels better. Once again, having and sharing these opinions isn't a problem, but when the title of your video is Why Dark Souls 3 is Better Than Elden Ring, a video analysis, and you don't argue any objective points, that is a problem. If you titled your video, Why I Think Dark Souls 3 is Better Than Elden Ring instead, all would be just fine.
While playing through Dark Souls 3, I didn't know what the freak was going on, who I was fighting, or why I was trying to slaughter the lords of the land. For some reason though, I was intrigued and interested in finding out why I was killing things, and I wanted to read item descriptions and listen to the NPC dialogue and pay attention during the weird freaking cutscenes. Now, Elden Ring has some of this weird, cryptic, almost optional storytelling as Dark Souls 3, but I don't actually care about any of it for some reason. Alright, looks like we're riding a glowing coffin down into a pit of scarlet rot. I don't care. Oh wow, there's this giant city underneath the land. I don't care why it's here though. It's hard to put into words why I just feel more captivated by one and not the other, but I think it has to do with the open world map of Elden Ring, which by the way, is the best open world game I've ever played, so props. But it's not as good as the more linear experience of Dark Souls 3.
I don't actually care about any of it. I don't care. I don't care why it's here. I just feel more captivated by one and not the other. I don't believe going into too much detail about this part is necessary, as once again, sounding like a broken record here, it is all entirely subjective. You're not making any arguments. How is this an analysis when you're just saying you like one more than the other? Also, if you didn't know what was going on while playing, that should be considered bad storytelling. If the story is telling you nothing you can understand or make sense of, that's not good. Also, you are comparing a very linear, almost level select structured game to an open world game, two very different things, which doesn't make sense to compare in the first place. Not to mention, you're completely ignoring the ability to fast travel in both games, and the impact that can have on players' interaction with the world.
I think this is partially the case because in a game like Elden Ring, the open world has certain storyline beats that progress the game forward. Like, an example, when you kill Godric, this little chamber opens up behind him, and you can go into it. But then, instead of opening up a new area, it kind of just pops you back out into the land which you already could have explored. In Dark Souls 3, when you beat a boss, it unlocks the next area to explore. But in Elden Ring, you can kind of just explore anything at any time because of the freedom of being able to travel anywhere. And because Elden Ring is an open world map, you can encounter these areas and these bosses in any order you really want. And it's much harder, if you think about it from a developer's perspective, to try to tell a story when the reader can just flip to all these random pages in any order that they like.
When you kill Godric, it opens a door and through a series of rooms reveals Liurnia of the Lakes. Yes, it is possible to go around. But getting the area early serves as a reward for exploration. It is still a grand reveal, further encouraging the player to continue exploring off the main path. Not only that, the reveal of Liurnia is significant, serving as one of the first big area reveals and map expansions in the game, especially considering how well of a job Caelid does of deterring new and or low-leveled players with the difficulty spike of the area. The alternative is the Weeping Peninsula, which many have described as a tutorial area with easier dungeons, simpler enemies, and a mostly self-contained quest taking place in Castle Morn. I understand where you're coming from with the comparison to flipping through a book to random pages, but this comparison doesn't quite work. Ignoring the sequence break glitches that speedrunners use on older patch versions, can you kill Fire Giant before you kill Margit? Can you kill Gideon before killing Malekith? Can you kill Hoarah before killing any two Shardbearers? There are still limitations to the freedom we have as the player. It may not feel like it at times, with how much we are able to do, but we can't go anywhere, whenever we want.
Elden Ring incentivizes you flipping to random pages, and it's a lot of fun, and it's a plus 10 for exploration, but I'm arguing that it's a minus 10 for the storyline and pacing that a well-crafted narrative could be. And now, I want to say this, I know Dark Souls 3 isn't like a strict linear game, like at an early Mario level, you just go left to right. I know it's not like that. But Dark Souls 3 definitely channels you strongly into certain world directions and puts you down more linear style levels that branch out. It's like a tree, it's all connected together at the roots, and you can explore different branches as they connect to each other.
You know what else channels you? Strongly? Elden Ring. Sights of Grace have a literal arrow pointing you to the nearest main objective. That is more aggressive channeling than anything in Dark Souls 3. The thing about Elden Ring, which is similar to Dark Souls, is that the openness of the world is almost entirely optional. Exploration is strongly recommended, and many players will find themselves doing so either out of curiosity or out of a feeling of necessity to level up. Regardless, you have the freedom to ignore the open world completely. You can follow the guidance of Grace and go from main objective to the next, with very little exploration in between. Just like in Dark Souls, if you know which way to go, why ever deviate from the path? Both games employ fast travel from the start, and for players not interested in engaging with the world more than they have to, they can simply opt out whenever able by warping instead. Also, I find the description of the world as a tree, all connected together at the roots branching out, very appropriate. For Dark Souls 1, that is. For Dark Souls 3, this could not be further from the truth. Dark Souls 3 is the closest you'll get to a level select in a Souls game.
Elden Ring is more like a big horizontal map where dungeons and castles are spaced apart, and I guess they're kind of technically connected by this open land. But that open space doesn't necessarily move the narrative forward. I like it better when every inch of the level moves me toward a path of completion in Dark Souls 3. In Elden Ring, you are incentivized to run around and backtrack and explore in circles, but that lessens the narrative experience to me. And I'm not saying it's bad, it's just not as good.
Once again, your use of subjectivity breaks the entire section. You're admitting you're not arguing a point and instead are telling us what you like and that we should agree because you like it. To make one more point though, in response to what you concluded with here, you are incentivized to explore. But again, that does not mean it is out of necessity. Not every single second of any game needs to be developing the narrative. I don't think there's much narrative relevance of killing a handful of skeletons or hollows between bonfires. There is downtime between story segments for you to relax, at least as much as you can in a From Software game. It honestly sounds like you're just arguing for less optional content, as optional content is not required for story progression. And you seem to be saying all things in a playthrough should move the narrative forward. I could be taking that too literally, but I find it hard to believe many players would ask for less optional content in a game, even if some of it was repeated. Additionally, one could argue, which I will not because I am not knowledgeable enough about the lore, nor am I particularly interested in it enough to do the required research just to make this one point here, and I will fully admit that. But if you're exploring, you'll be finding more in-game items, weapons, armor, and all of those things will have item descriptions. That being the place where most of that indirect From Software style storytelling is. I don't know how many items in Elden Ring aid the narrative directly, but I'm guessing it all, or most of it, aids the world building at the very least, which would still be important information for someone invested in the story.
Let's face it, the PvP in Elden Ring is a heap of toxic trash. There's always been broken and glitched out weapons and lag in the other Souls games, but Elden Ring takes it to a new level with a number of broken tactics at hand. I will argue that Dark Souls 3 had the most respectable and fun, thriving PvP community in its heyday. Yes, there were toxic ganker cowards. Yes, there was Estus canceling there at the end, I remember. And I guess the most brutal PvP of all time in any game, where the invaders would hack into your computer and start stealing all your information. And all of this, with the exception of the hackers, which they're working on getting out, is still better than Elden Ring's PvP currently. Like I've already explained to you earlier, the over-reliance upon spells in PvE, guess what? Translates to the PvP too. And there's a lot of jank spells in this game. Do I need to talk about the Limgrave AFK farmers? Do I need to talk about the impossible to reach invasion areas? Do I need to talk about the invisible one-shot retaliation glitch? Do I need to talk about how it seems like every person is so brain dead they just constantly spam that Rivers of Blood weapon of war and hope to apply bleeding to enemies? Even though the weapon art doesn't even hit my body, it still applies a bleeding effect. It's so dumb. Do I need to talk about the bloody swarm spell everybody has, or the instant weapon of war, slice? How do you lose at PvP in Elden Ring? Use a sword. How to win at PvP? Spam your spells.
I'm afraid I missed the boat for the Dark Souls 3 PvP scene, as I didn't even play Dark Souls 3 for the first time until a few years ago. So I unfortunately can't respond from any first-hand experience. I also don't think there would be any value in playing it now. 7 years after release, 7 years of patches, fixes, balancing, and player experimentation with builds and playstyles, only to then compare it to Elden Ring, which as of me beginning writing this script has been out for not even a year and a half, but also keeping in mind that UnleashedBread's video came out not even a full 3 months after Elden Ring had been released. You also acknowledge things at the apparent end of the patch history for Dark Souls 3, in saying there was Estus canceling there at the end, meaning you aren't strictly comparing Dark Souls 3 2 months after launch to Elden Ring 2 months after launch. With that statement alone, you're admitting that you're looking at all of Dark Souls 3's post-launch development. You are comparing something that has had 7 years in the oven, post-initial release, to something that, for when your video was posted, had less than 3 months of changes. That is just blatantly misleading. Regardless, I won't defend Elden Ring here. I will simply say Elden Ring had, and has, plenty of problems with the PvP offerings, many of which you rightly point out, the exact same way Dark Souls 3 did. I think it's fair to say they're both good at some things, and similarly bad at others. They are different games after all, different IPs, meaning they should provide different experiences. And it's unfortunate that they both have, or had, so many issues. I just hope down the line we can all look back and say, the PvP in Elden Ring may not have been perfect at launch, but has greatly improved since. Attention is then called to the lack of covenants in Elden Ring. I agree. It is something that surely could have been in the game, implemented without intrusion, similar to how it functioned in the Souls games. If covenants didn't function, or maybe fit in terms of lore, I have to believe there is at least some way to implement an equivalent, some type of faction system with which you could align if desired. He talks about the covenant system providing additional incentive for PvP, ways to unlock new benefits. There's also achievements tied to them in the Souls games. There's a lot of opportunity and player freedom that comes with the faction system. I'm confident that the majority of Souls players who are watching this video would agree that having covenants as an option wouldn't be a detriment to the game, not unless it was required and/or bugged, broken in some way. So long as it functioned properly and as intended, would very likely only be a benefit.
Now the last chapter here I want to discuss before the conclusion is the replayability in Elden Ring. Elden Ring is like eating a delicious and large egg salad sandwich. It tastes amazing in the moment, but you are thoroughly done with the idea of it when you're completed. You're not craving another serving. Dark Souls 3 is like a refreshing glass of water. It seems like I have a constant appetite for more as time goes on. Now, that is probably a terrible analogy, but what I'm trying to say is that over time, Dark Souls 3 actually drove me to replay this game over and over again because I think it's more skill-based. Elden Ring is really not skill-based as it is spell-based, and armor-based, and location of loot-based. And I've already kicked that point to the ground. I think it's self-explanatory at this point to say it's more fulfilling to me to replay a game using the skills that I've mastered rather than just like finding the OP spells, finding the OP items, and then cheesing the bosses. I also think the open world in Elden Ring accounts for the lack of draw back to the lands between. Exploring this tarnished land is enthralling the first time, but you can't rediscover an area or a boss you already know is there. It's a certain novelty the first time around, which is awesome, I love it. Dark Souls 3, for some reason, still does not feel novel to me. And maybe my gameplay style hurts me here, because I like to scour the land and look in every nook and cranny, go in every building, look through every secret for cool surprises. And we all know Elden Ring has a ginormous map, and it's possible that the developers intended you to explore different parts of this map and find different secrets on different playthroughs. But if you're like me, I gorged myself with all 16 courses of the egg salad sandwich on my first playthrough, and it tasted great. But now I don't feel like there's anything for me to go back to. I don't feel compelled in the same way I do with Dark Souls 3. Now, there's still light down the tunnel, potentially for Elden Ring's DLCs.
I have a few things to say to this. 1, egg salad sandwiches are severely underappreciated. They do, in fact, taste amazing. Silliness aside, you are only arguing this point because of the decisions you have made. You reduce playing Elden Ring to finding the OP spells, trying OP items, and then cheesing the bosses. When, if that is your experience replaying Elden Ring, simply stop replaying it that way. If you don't enjoy it, do something different. Elden Ring has 308 weapons in it, compared to the 220 in Dark Souls 3. Elden Ring has 101 incantations, compared to the 32 sorceries in Dark Souls 3. Elden Ring has over 100 bosses, which can be higher or lower depending on how you count duplicates and reskins, but a huge amount regardless, compared to the 25 in Dark Souls 3, and that is including DLC. Additionally, here is a map comparison of the Dark Souls 3 base game map in its entirety against Elden Ring's 2 starting areas, Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula, with the explanation also on screen if you want to pause and read through it. Now, this is not my calculation, and I'm unfortunately not in a position to fact-check this, so take of it what you will. But Dark Souls 3 apparently fits into the Elden Ring starting areas twice over. You may want to argue that verticality is not taken into consideration, as there are significant vertical changes in Dark Souls 3, but that also means you need to acknowledge that it doesn't account for the verticality of Elden Ring either, nor does it include any caves or dungeons. With all that said, you're telling me you have all this space, all these weapons, all these abilities, all these enemies and bosses to fight in all these different locations, but every time you have gone to replay Elden Ring, you can't break free from the formula of OP spells, cheese boss, board. I simply don't understand why you would do that to yourself. If you like the melee combat of Dark Souls 3, and that's why you replay it, then when you play Elden Ring, do so with different melee builds. If you don't want to explore or wander the open world, just stick to the main path. If you've beaten it already, which you said you play through the games with both melee and magic, so I think it's reasonable to assume you've beaten it at least twice, I would hope you'd have a decent idea of where to go and what to do, so you can avoid whatever amount of exploring you want. The replay value is up to you, but Elden Ring objectively gives the player more options, more variety, and more freedom than Dark Souls 3 does. Your lack of enjoyment in the thing that gives you more to do is purely your opinion, and that opinion has been developed only by how you choose to interact with it. You have not argued that Elden Ring is objectively less replayable than Dark Souls 3 here at all.
Like I've already talked about, I would love to see a huge multiplayer renaissance in this game, where they make it more balanced and more fun, and take a look at it. That would draw me to play this game for at least a little while longer. And those are my feelings on the replayability of Elden Ring, which really is just a culmination of all the chapters, all the points I've already talked about. I think ER's strongest point in this right now is that there's so many different ways to approach this game, such a big variety of weapons. But I will argue that the sheer potential variety of playstyles doesn't necessarily make the actual combat more or less fun.
I am genuinely curious as to what your perspective is now on Elden Ring's PvP, since we've, at this point, had plenty of time with the Colosseum update. I don't know if it's the multiplayer renaissance you were hoping for, but I am curious. I know a lot of people were happy with that update. It is also slightly concerning that you just admitted Elden Ring's strongest point in this right now is that there's so many different ways to approach. Yet, just a moment ago, you talked about how the only way you approach it is by, again, going straight for the OP spells to cheese bosses and then get bored. You're admitting that your lack of enjoyment is self-imposed, as you recognize the variety, but clearly have chosen to ignore it when you replay it.
The perfect point to this is Sekiro. Really, throughout the game, if you haven't played it, there's only one blade you use, and you spend the whole time mastering it, and it feels so good at the end of the game to master this one blade. Dark Souls 3, however, has struck a different sort of balance. Since its launch, I've probably gone through and beaten it like 12 or 15 times, and I'm always excited to go back and start it again so that I can end up fighting Gale at that epic boss fight at the end of the Souls series. Elden Ring, we'll see how the DLCs go. It just does not have the same replayability as Dark Souls 3 to me.
I find this last point very interesting, and I'm going to go on quite a tangent with it. I find it inaccurate to say you master the sword in Sekiro. I would say it's because you can't change it, which means you have more opportunity for mastery in the Souls games and Elden Ring. You don't have a weapon loadout the same way you do in Elden Ring or the Souls series. The developers have limited you to that sword and that base moveset, meaning all of your focus goes to everything else, freeing you from thinking about the sword itself. The sword does not matter. What you do master is the mechanics of the combat system. You master the timing of deflections, the moveset of each enemy type and boss, your traversal around the map and how to utilize it to your advantage, your equipment and your prosthetics. You master the core of the game, not necessarily the sword. The sword itself isn't that relevant of a component when it comes to the actual moment-to-moment gameplay because it is static. It is an unchanging piece of your arsenal. I will argue that the Soul series and Elden Ring give you more opportunity for a sense of mastery of equipment because you can freely change it and because of the variety in equipment. Let's say you start Elden Ring with the Bandit class, and you use only the starting dagger for the first half of the game. You become more than familiar, comfortable with the timing of the dagger, the reach, the different attacks at your disposal. The dagger and the abilities associated with it is your arsenal, and you get comfortable with it. I'd even say you master it. Then, let's say after that halfway point, you find your way to the greatsword located in Caelid. Abandon the dagger and start cosplaying as Guts from Berserk. This is a new weapon, and with that comes new attacks, stats, damage output numbers, new timings to learn, and far greater reach than the dagger could provide. Here begins the road to mastery. You will still learn and hopefully eventually master the mechanics of each boss, enemies, their moves, their timings, but you have new timings on your end too, as it's all through a new lens, the lens of your new weapon. That thing in your character's hands that you now have to be conscious of. Your new weapon is significantly heavier than the dagger you used previously, making it at times almost unbearably slow compared to the dagger. You have to take the time to learn the weapon. It is now at the forefront of each encounter because you have to take into consideration the new distance you can reach, higher damage output, higher probability of staggering and shield breaking, significantly slower attack speed, heavier overall weight, which could potentially give you a different roll speed, which is another timing to learn. Successfully adapting to all of these changes and learning to capitalize on them is mastery of that weapon. It's something you chose to use out of your own free will, no matter how difficult or foreign it was compared to what you used before. You are now aware of the mechanics of that new weapon. You adapt, and eventually you master. And that's of course on top of all of the other base mechanics in the game. You are just now conscious of the weapon you are using and how you are using it. Alright, tangent complete. You then close this part by talking about fighting Gale at the end, which you've mentioned a few times is your favorite boss in all of the Souls games. So is Dark Souls 3 more replayable than Elden Ring objectively? Or is it just replayable for you because you get to fight your favorite boss, Gale, at the end of it?
Yeah, I guess in conclusion, I do want to say I really do love Elden Ring. It was a great game and it was certainly worth making from Software. I think I just have a couple criticisms and critiques that I'd like to see remedied in future releases. But I love the game, I recommend you play it. Dark Souls 3 is better, okay? But I'll leave you with that. Peace out, have a good one everybody, take care, so long.
The end indeed. I will echo that I hope we see the issues with the game remedied in the future. After all, we just want the best games possible, players and developers alike, I'm sure. I hope videos like these help make that happen. Also, this is only my second video, and I've wanted to start a YouTube channel for quite some time. Critical analysis and direct response content like this has always been some of the most interesting to me, so I figured I'd give it a try. Hopefully you found my attempt at this interesting, or at least enjoyable. UnleashedBread, I do hope you see this video and that it motivates you to continue content creation. In reading some of the comments and your responses to them on your video, I can see you truly care about the games you play, and the quality of them, and the quality of your content too. So I really hope to see more videos from you in the future. Thank you all so much for watching, especially those of you who stuck around through the whole thing. I really hope you enjoyed. I hope there were some interesting, maybe even insightful points made, or that you were at the very least entertained. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the video, how I can improve anything I missed, or what your opinion is on Dark Souls 3 versus Elden Ring, and why one might be better than the other. Anyways, stay happy, stay healthy, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks for watching.